The local historical society in Virginia is challenging the claim of current members of the Patawomeck Indian Tribe, suggesting they may actually just be Euro-American residents of Patawomeck land. This comes as the Patawomeck have been fighting a renewed fight all year thus far for recognition.
So the state of Virginia is once again in the news as we speak for its problematic history with indigenous nations, and this time it is specifically pertaining to the Patawomeck Indian Tribe. Maybe you've heard of the Patawomeck, maybe you have not heard of the Patawomeck, but the issue now extends to them for federal recognition that has been denied them because of the actions of the state of Virginia. This has been a common story with Virginia. This has been a common problem with them for many other indigenous nations in the past. We're not just going to focus on the story with the Patawomeck in this episode, but we are going to focus on them a little bit. We're going to jump back and look at the other tribes who have had to deal with the exact same thing that they are now trying to do, which is get federal recognition from the state. They are trying to get federal recognition. This has been done specifically in Virginia over and over and over. We want to look at the tribes that did it before them and see how their journey informs this journey, but we also want to look at what these tribes all have in common and what the issue is for all of them, because it directly impacts the federal recognition that dark-skinned Indians have been denied for a very long time. They're saying a Virginia tribe says racism wiped their native identity from historic records. Nearly a century later, they're still fighting for recognition. That's the CNN treatment of the story. We're going to look more at the story itself in a minute, but I want us to backtrack first so that we can get some additional context.
It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Unehiya, reporting live on behalf of the Great Spirit, Aye, I share, Aye, to let you know that despite what they told you, your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness and your law is the truth, not theirs. All right, we're gonna set this party off right. Let's do it correctly and make contact with respect to the Great Spirit. Aye, I share, Aye, be alerted. Let your servant vibrate on your frequency. Harmonize with me. You've tested my heart. Trust me to report your message. Program me against transgression. Speak, Selah. Don't subscribe unless you want to mind. No thumbs up unless you know what's up. If what I say, if anything that I say rubs you the wrong way, smash that dislike button. What I'm vibrating on today and the vibration I'm trying to get y'all on today is about, kind of the implications that we can glean from the Thomasina E. Jordan Indian Tribes of Virginia Federal Recognition Act of 2018. Those implications of what that act, the passage of that bill means, have flown under the radar. It's actually an Obama era Senate resolution passed during the Trump era by which the federal government acknowledged certain grotesqueries of American history pertaining to the Native Americans. The congressional hearings dealing with this bill explicitly recognized and validated the paper genocide theory, which is monumental. Some of you may not realize why it's monumental. Some of you may not realize paper genocide was once considered just a wild conspiracy theory. Mainstream media at one time considered this term to be a reference only to things that occurred in other countries, never in the United States. Federal recognition of paper genocide is a big deal all by itself, because it means when people argue with you on this basis, you can now remind them that the federal government already officially acknowledged the truth on this. Tell them go take it up with Congress when they argue with you about this. All right. However, there are other implications that go along with what they acknowledged. And none of that's really being discussed as much as it should. I want to make sure we understand what all the implications actually are. Okay.
Earlier we mentioned the Patawomeck Indians, and they are the indigenous tribe for whom the Potomac River is named. Some of the people connected to the Potomac might surprise you though. I want to take a look at one of the people who would most likely surprise you with his Patawomeck ancestry, and that is arguably the greatest abolitionist of either wave of the civil rights movement, which would be Frederick Douglass. I want to look at Frederick Douglass's newspaper real quick. For those of you who didn't know, Frederick Douglass did have a newspaper. His editorial print actually came with some very fierce commentary at a critical time when there was a lot of talk from whites and blacks about black people in the United States immigrating, with an E, allegedly back, quote unquote, back to Africa. This concept, of course, was very controversial, has been very controversial for a long time. Even within the black community today, it remains a point of controversy. Frederick Douglass had perhaps even more interesting things to say about this concept before you even get to the Garvey period. Before you get to any of that, deal with Frederick Douglass, whose mindset was such that he couldn't even fathom the notion that his people would ever seriously consider immigrating to Africa.
A Denton Journal article from the year 1900 reads on page 2, quote, Mrs. Caroline Dall of Washington says Douglass once told her his mother was a Patawomeck Indian and his father a white man. The notion of his father being a white man has been determined even within his own lifetime to not be true, but no one has debunked the notion of his mother being an Indian of the Potomac Society. Reading from Frederick Douglass's newspaper article now archived by the Library of Congress, quote, there is no sentiment more universally entertained, nor more firmly held by the free colored people of the United States, than that this is their own, their native land, referring to black Americans and calling this their native land, continuing, and that here, for good or for evil, their destiny is to be wrought out. Identified with the entire history of the American people, going back more than 200 years, this sentiment is natural and praiseworthy. There is not now, there never has been, and we think there never will be, any general desire on the part of our people, to emigrate from this land to any other, and least of all, to the wilds of Africa. Strong words from Frederick Douglass, renowned abolitionist of the 19th century. Lastly, we go to an excerpt of his own speech at the Carlisle Indian Institute as quoted in the 2018 book by Dixon Preston, the renowned Douglassonian and historian. Dixon writes, for that matter, his roots may have reached back even further, into the beginnings of the American experience than those of almost any Anglo-Saxon white, into American prehistory. A substantial body of evidence suggests that Douglass was part Indian. Strong family tradition supports this view. Your cousin Tom Bailey told me that your grandmother, Betsy Bailey, was of Indian descent. Lewis Douglass wrote his father while visiting Eastern Shore relatives in 1865. Certainly Douglass looked Indian, with his broad forehead, heavy cheekbones, and yellow-brown skin. While he never publicly confirmed that he had an Indian ancestor, perhaps because he wasn't sure the family tradition was true, he gave broad hints of it in his speeches and writings. On one occasion he appeared to boast of an Indian background. In a speech at the Carlisle Indian Institute, he told the assembled student body, I rejoice beyond expression at what I have seen and heard at this Carlisle School for Indians. I have been known as a Negro, but I wish to be known here and now as Indian. There are other indications. When Frederick was a child, his master, Aaron Anthony, called him his little Indian boy.
On September 25th, 2008, in front of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, Representative Jim Moran, he's a Democrat from Virginia, representative in the House, and this was a Senate committee, but he made a statement in front of this Senate committee when the Thomasina E. Jordan Indian Tribes of Virginia Federal Recognition Act was introduced in session. And in his statement, Moran addressed paper genocide directly. He addressed paper genocide, legal deterrence against self-identifying as indigenous, and a concerted effort to classify all non-whites in America as colored and inferior. I want to read an excerpt from the transcript of his statement at that 2008 committee hearing. Quote, "The second unique circumstance for the Virginia tribes is what they experienced at the hands of the state government during the first half of the 20th century. It has been called a paper genocide. At a time when the federal government granted Native Americans the right to vote, Virginia's elected officials adopted racial, hostile laws targeted at those classes of people who did not fit into the dominant white society. The fact that some of Virginia's ruling elite claimed to be blood descendants of Pocahontas in their view meant that no one else in Virginia could make a claim that they were Native American and a descendant of Pocahontas's people. To do so would mean that Virginia's ruling elite were what they decreed all non-whites to be, part of the inferior Negroid race." End quote. Stop right there. What's he mean? He's saying they had white people claiming indigenous heritage. First of all, let that sink in. These are the Native Americans you're used to seeing today.
Okay, let's play a game of Spot the Native American. In this game, I hold up 2 cards, and you tell me which card has a picture of a Native American on it. No trick questions. Ready? Here we go. Which one is the Native American? The one on the left or the one on the right? If you pick the one on the left, you are correct. This is Chuck Hoskin Jr., the current chief of the Cherokee Nation. On the right is Georgia Senator John Ossoff, Jewish on his father's side and Australian on his mother's side. Let's do another round. Which one is the Native American? The one on the left or the one on the right? If you pick the one on the right, you are incorrect. This is Arizona Representative Juan Ciscomani III, who is actually Latino. On the left, we have Chuck Hoskin Sr., father of the current Cherokee chief and former state legislator for the 6th District in Oklahoma. Care for one more try? Here goes. Which one is the Native American? The one on the left or the one on the right? If you pick the one on the right, you are correct. This is New Mexico Representative Yvette Harrell, the first Cherokee woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. On the left, we have Texas Representative Mayra Flores, who is in fact Mexican American. Thanks for playing. How did you do?
Okay, white people. Mind you, the time period to which he's referring is the early 1900s. They also wanted to protect that class of people by making sure no other claims to that same heritage took away these Native Americans' claim to whiteness. Why? Because these Native Americans were blessed with white privilege plus entitlements to reparations through their respective federally recognized tribes. They were voting constituents of the Democratic Republic of the United States. Whites were okay with extending peerage to white Native Americans. They were not okay with extending the same peerage to other Native Americans. That's what Moran's talking about. Remember, Moran acknowledged that the white natives he's talking about were quote unquote elites. That's his own word for them. They were elites. What would jeopardize their station? Any reminder that they're not fully white. That's what would jeopardize their status. These natives were white because of incessant intermarriage between white men and Aboriginal women for 300 years already by that time. I have another video planned to explain the dynamic of colonizers marrying into prominent indigenous families to consolidate political power between Europeans and so-called Indians. In a previous video, we already talked about the fact that William Penn, founder and first governor of the Pennsylvania colony, referred to these women and their peoples as black and swarthy. Right? It's also worth reminding you that he was convinced that they were Hebrew, and he explained all the uncanny observations of Yatzarali customs that led him to think so. That led him to think that they were Hebrew. America began with 3 centuries of intermarrying between specifically elite black women and elite white men. And by the time period Moran's talking about, those 3 centuries are behind you already. Intermarriage for 3 centuries straight. So this produced whitewashed indigenous bloodlines of matrilineal descent. By that I mean the indigenous part of them was only passing through the mothers. Neither elite black men nor black commoners of either gender were intermarrying with whites, however, which basically means they continued to produce black children amongst each other, generation after generation. They also intermarried to some degree with slaves from Africa. This means there were 2 sets of Aboriginal bloodlines: mixed lineages and unadulterated lineages. Mixed and unmixed. The latter, the unmixed, would most likely outnumber the former by quite a bit because of how selective the mixed lineages were being, because they were targeting elitism. They didn't want to just intermarry with the common folk of our nation. They only wanted to intermarry with those who carried social and political power among us. And I mean, do you understand the significance of that? Just applying rudimentary logic to understanding how the generations would have had to progress in this circumstance inherently means Indians split into dark and light, and the dark bloodlines would have to outnumber the light bloodlines. They would have to. The elite women of indigenous nations would only constitute 1/2 of the 1%ers of each nation intermarrying with Europeans. At best, they constitute 1/2 of the 1%ers. Of the 1%ers. They don't represent half of our community. They represent half of the elites. They represent the female half of the tip-top 1%ers of each nation. That's who was intermarrying with the Europeans, with the settlers, the foreigners. That's a very narrow demographic, getting narrower as it goes. And you've got what Moran's describing, what he's talking about. White America's giving rights to white Indians and getting nervous about what that might mean for black Indians, so-called Indians, right? They're inadvertently creating an avenue by which those black Indians can access the privileges that their white counterparts are accessing. This is why Moran said allowing those blacks to make the same claims these whites were making would prove that a portion of the white elites was related to the black Indians and therefore, quote unquote, part of the Negroid inferior race. That's how he put it. That's how Moran put it, right? We read that. Now, he would say he phrased it that way because if you were to ask Moran, I imagine he would say that the reason he phrased it that way is because the black Indians were consolidated with the slaves brought from Africa to brand them as Negroes. However, the way he phrased it is exceptionally accurate because the original native was indeed Negroid in the sense that they and the slaves brought from Africa were of the same ancestry, which may very well have been common information originally. These are the same people, I already talked about this. These are the same people split into separate ethnic groups over time. The people brought over from Africa and the people who were already here are the same people. They're the same people. I already did a video, a whole video about this, which is why my last video discussed the theological and historical uses of the term Negro that ostensibly referred not to all so-called black people in general, but rather to one specific set of ethnic groups. Their maps charted so-called Negro land as the region of West Africa where the Negroes were. That can't mean black because the African continent is predominantly black, right? Negroes were distinct from the rest based on something else. That term was then also attributed to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They were called Negroes, while Europeans called a select group in Africa Negroes. We've got those two things happening at the same time. All this suggested that whites always knew that the people they were calling Negroes weren't African in origin. They found Negroes in Africa, but Negroes weren't African. I talked about this in my previous video about the possibility that colonizers already knew who Negroes were, and this was a more narrowly defined group than we traditionally think. Don't forget, you came up with the term African American to describe yourself.
You're looking at an article published by the Associated Press in December of 1988. The lead reads, quote, "A group of black leaders, including the Reverend Jesse Jackson, says members of their race would prefer to be called African Americans rather than blacks." End quote. This marks the moment when the rest of the world first began to acknowledge a hyphenated identity for black people. If you keep reading, Jesse Jackson reportedly said, quote, "Just as we were called colored, but we're not that, and then Negro, but not that, to be called black is just as baseless. To be called African Americans has cultural integrity. It puts us in our proper historical context. Every ethnic group in this country has a reference to some land base, some historical cultural base. African Americans have hit that level of cultural maturity." End quote.
And don't get mad at Jesse Jackson, okay? Don't get mad at Jesse Jackson. He was just doing what he thought was best for his people with the information that we were all working with at the time. It wasn't time for us to awaken yet. You were still supposed to be asleep, and you did stay asleep, and he was acting in sleep just the same way all our other leaders were, okay? That's how sleep works. The whole purpose of this channel is that the Indian Negro and the Negro from Africa were related to one another the entire time, and that Europeans knew it all along. We were kinfolk who had been reunited after 2.5 millennia of being separated.
Hey y'all, first of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unehiya is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unehiya is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
This is why what Moran said next in his statement before the Indian Affairs Committee is so important. You thought I forgot what I was reading. We're still gonna read this. I read a portion of the excerpt. I'm not done yet. We're finally gonna get back to what else he said after that. Quote, "With great hypocrisy, Virginia's ruling elite pushed policies that culminated with the enactment of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This act directed state officials and zealots like Walter Plecker to destroy state and local courthouse records and reclassify in Orwellian fashion all non-whites as colored. It targeted Native Americans with a vengeance, denying Native Americans in Virginia their identity. To call yourself a Native American in Virginia was to risk a jail sentence of up to 1 year." End quote. What he's acknowledging there is that Aborigines whom the government didn't recognize as Indians weren't allowed to self-identify anymore. Federally recognized Indians were called Native Americans. What color are those Native Americans? White. They were already white by this time. They had been white. For unrecognized Aborigines to declare the same heritage was a criminal offense from the passage of this bill in 1924 until 1967, when a US Supreme Court decision rendered it unconstitutional. And by then, the damage was done. Who were these Aborigines that were not allowed to identify as Native American? Because you've created this term called Native American, and you've given it to all these white people who claim indigenous heritage. They are the seed of matrilineal descent. What's indigenous about them is only passed down to them by matrilineal descent. All their fathers are white people, and many of their mothers are decreasingly indigenous as you go down the bloodline as well. Because what? Because all this intermarriage involves some mixed women as well. Some of them are some of these marriages are with mixed women who are the daughters or granddaughters of prominent tribeswomen of the native nations, right? The Aboriginal nations. So the bloodline is getting very rapidly diluted. As I already said, I'm gonna do a whole video about that. Blood quantum, we're gonna go into that. But who are these Aborigines? These are unrecognized Aborigines. Who are the unrecognized Aborigines? They're the so-called Indians who didn't civilize themselves by integrating or intermarrying whites. They were black. What do you think they identified as if they couldn't identify by their tribes anymore? Keep in mind also that state officials went around destroying courthouse records of who these black natives were. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. The purpose of the term colored was to serve as a catch-all for this very reason. So what did their identity become at that point? Colored. The impetus to enact paper genocide, according to Congressman Moran, was that some of the societal elites, whites, were claiming indigenous descent. He also acknowledged that the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was the culmination of all this, a year after Congressman Moran's statement was given. So he gave that statement in 2008. 2008, he was saying this, and we were voting for Obama. I own it. I did. I voted for Obama. I don't have no problem. I have no problem telling you I voted for Obama. Senator Byron Dorgan. Senator Byron Dorgan. This is a year after. So in 2008, we have Moran's statement, and then in 2009, Senator Byron Dorgan, he's a Democratic senator, once again, Democratic Party, representing North Dakota. Senator Byron Dorgan submitted a report pursuant to discussion on this bill, Senate Bill 1178. If you ever want to look it up, what I keep referring to as the Thomasina E. Jordan Indian Tribes of Virginia Federal Recognition Act of 2018. Yeah, you can just type S1178. If you ever want to look it up, Senate 1178, that's what bill this is, or was. It's law now. It passed. This is Senate Report 111 through 113. Senate Report 111-113. This was 2009, and at that time, Senator Dorgan chaired the Indian Affairs Committee. Remember, the Indian Affairs Committee is the committee that Moran was addressing when he gave his statement in 2008. Here we are, 2009. The chair of the committee submits this report. I'm pulling this report directly from the US government publishing office because I want to make sure that's the link I provide in the description box below so that you can see this is not just on somebody's blog. I'm linking you directly to the report itself so you can see where it is. I'm gonna read an excerpt from the report. Quote, officials from the state's Bureau of Vital Statistics interpreted the law as allowing them to go back and change a person's birth certificate if they believed that there was evidence that the person was not fully white. The primary target of the racial integrity law was the African American community.
So these 6 indigenous nations that we're talking about with the Thomasina E. Jordan Act were excluded from federal recognition as Indians because, and we keep using this term Indians, why? Because that's the legal term. These nations, they were excluded for 2 key reasons. One was their physical appearance, their phenotype, race as a social construct. That was number 1. So when we say that the African American community was targeted, that's what the bill said. Or that's what the statement is that's been made in advocacy of this bill by the lawmakers who got it passed, right? We're looking at that. The African American community specifically was targeted by the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which was instrumental in getting these nations excluded. So make it make sense. Now, check this out. In spite of that, the other reason that they were excluded is something that Virginia Senator Tim Kaine alluded to in the actual hearing where this bill passed and became law. This act was ratified, and Tim Kaine, who represents the state of Virginia, spoke on what one of the other issues were with these nations that got them hung up. It wasn't just race, and we need to tell the whole story.
So just to clarify, Senator Dorgan's using the term African American, but as we already covered, that term didn't exist during the time period Dorgan's talking about. The colored community was targeted, and it was predominantly comprised of indigenous people because, as Unehiya stated in his video about the Indian Education Bill currently before Congress, only 1 in 10 enslaved people in mainland North America as of 1860 came from Africa. The rest were indigenous.
However, proponents of the agenda heralded by the eugenics movement saw the Virginia Indian community as a threat. This was because the racial integrity law allowed persons of white and Virginia Indian ancestry, as long as it was not more than 1/16 of Indian blood quantum, to be classified as white. End quote.
In other words, the threat people feared was that, even with the Racial Integrity Act in place, Negroes might be able to earn the classification of whiteness by proving 1/16 Indian ancestry via blood quantum. Whites in the early 20th century were unsettled by the idea that, A, blacks might gain white privilege in some way, and, B, whites with Native American ancestry might be bringing blacks into white privilege by way of familial connections. Paper genocide became a necessary evil to deny Negroes the right to identify as Indians, because this removed any way for blacks to accidentally get classified as white on paper somehow.
Hey, hold up, Shirkela. Your illustration just now showed a black girl at the end being only 1/16 Indian. Is that common? And is that because her family tree had white people in it?
I mean, honestly, there's really not just one way that this happened to each family, so it's hard to come up with a fair example. What I can say is that dark-skinned indigenous people wouldn't be labeled as only 1/16 Indian just because of intermarriage with Euro-Americans. That fraction, 1/16, was the maximal blood quantum limit for an Indian to be designated white. Any more than that, and the Indian in question would be called Negro or colored. Indians were being separated into white and black based on who mixed with Europeans and who didn't. But black Indians then had to be stopped from identifying as Indian altogether to make sure they couldn't get classified as white. That leaves the only people still publicly identifying as Indian being white. Meanwhile, black people would only make such claims behind closed doors, which means traditions get lost. And all that's left is your 1940s grandmother telling you privately that she has Pequot Indian ancestry. Once black baby boomers started identifying as African, you started phrasing that differently too. You would say, I have Pequot in me, because decades of social engineering leads you to think your phenotype is an automatic confirmation of African ancestry. You gradually switched from saying you were non-Samoned Indian to just saying you had non-Samoned Indian in you, implying it was only part of your ethnic composition. And then you'd forget the non-Samoned part, so you'd just say Indian. That's further reinforced when you look at Native Americans and see tan white people. Blood quantum is complicated, so that'll take longer to explain. Suffice it to say for now, just because your blood quantum is 1/16 doesn't mean you're genuinely 1/16 Indian. In fact, blood quantum is almost guaranteed to have no bearing on how indigenous you really are.
We're going to do a separate video. I already said we're going to do a separate video on how blood quantum works. We're also going to cover eugenics in a separate video. I'm not going to do eugenics in this video. It's too much. Continuing, quote, I'm still reading the report. Quote, supporters of the law, including Dr. Walter Plecker, the registrar for Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, saw the exception in the law for Indians as an opportunity for persons of mixed heritage of African American and Native American ancestry to move eventually out of the category of colored and into the category of white. Thus, officials from the state's Bureau of Vital Statistics actively sought to denigrate and deny persons of Virginia Indian descent the right to identify themselves as Indians or white, and forced them to be declared colored, end quote. So, the racial integrity law forced Indians to identify with the other black people, right? It targeted so-called African American community, according to Senator Dorgan. That was the target. The African American community was the target. The two communities were forced to act as one, but they could do so in part because they already looked like the same people anyway.
So my thing is, a lot of times we act like us being Aboriginal means it wasn't no slaves dragged over here from Africa. That's a lie. Don't get carried away with this stuff. Truth is white people did bring a few 100,000 of them to North America, and the Chesapeake region was the main area them slaves came through. That includes Virginia and Maryland, so yeah, when they talk about two colored communities being blended together, they not lying. There definitely were descendants of slaves from Africa mixed into this community, but those hundreds of thousands did not become part of this community cause a lot of them got dispersed throughout the eastern half of North America. So the coloreds from Africa that stayed in Virginia would still be greatly outnumbered by the black Aborigines. And remember, our last video was about the fact that most Africans were never called Negroes. Europeans used the term for Indians in the Americas and just a handful of ethnic groups in certain pockets of the African continent. Unehiya talked about the reasons to think white folk connected specific groups in Africa to all the American Indians, right? That's who the slaves were that got brought here. We even saw that the Africans themselves felt like Negroes were foreigners in their land to begin with. Yes, slaves came from Africa, but they had an ancestral connection with Amerindian Aborigines. American Negroes were indigenous, African Negroes were foreign to both Africa and America. The ancestors of both are one specific, non-African ethnic group of ancient black people, and really this whole channel's about not just identifying who we are today, but also connecting that identity to that ancient ancestral group.
When the report acknowledges that the racial integrity law's primary target was the African American community, it has a citation referring back to testimony given in front of this committee on October 9th, 2002 by Dr. Danielle Moretti-Langholtz. At that time, it's citing her testimony. The testimony was from 2002. The testimony she gave, Dr. Moretti-Langholtz, she gave that testimony in 2002. At the time when she gave that testimony, she was the coordinator at American Indian Resource Center. This report we're reading is from 2009. It's referring back to her testimony as a citation for some of what it's saying. She's a white woman. Back in 2002, when she originally gave that testimony, she was a coordinator at the American Indian Resource Center in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, when she testified before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs about all this stuff that they're citing in this report. And she's now an anthropology professor at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. We've already covered the melanin issue, and we'll do a whole video on melanin, but we've already covered what color these people were. I'm not working so hard in this video to explain what color they were, but obviously they were dark. That's the only way you distinguish them from the white ones. So this same report states that all non-whites were classified as colored. Congressman Moran also links the white supremacist claim to a movement among government officials and quote-unquote zealots like Walter Plecker to destroy records that would prove Aboriginal descent for many families. So if you're thinking this only happened in Virginia, we keep talking about Virginia. If you're thinking this only happened in Virginia, you'd be partially right, because Virginia is famous as the state that actually legislated this injustice against the black Indian. However, the same attempts to erase the black Indian were happening everywhere without legislation. And the eugenics movement best demonstrates that, okay? Remember what Congressman Moran said. Walter Plecker and other zealots were going around haphazardly wiping the courthouse records of black Indians to reclassify them. Okay? Plecker's the face of the eugenics movement, and the report we just read said eugenics proponents feared that black Indians might try to classify as white to reap the benefits of their white counterparts. That's the whole point of this. The efforts of the eugenics movement went well beyond Virginia. Virginia is just the best example because it has been recognized by the federal government recently. I'm gonna link this. Here's a published journal article from a Warren E. Miltier in the 2016 issue of the North Carolina Historical Review. It shows that North Carolina is just another example with fewer legislative breadcrumbs to trace. The point of the article is to explain that Chowan Indians are still here, and that's what the article is about. They're still here, but it also explains why they're considered to not still be here, why they have at times been considered extinct. From the first page onto the second page, check this out. It says, a defeat in a years-long engagement with English colonists in 1677 ushered in momentous political and social changes for the Chowan people of eastern North Carolina. Since the arrival of Sir Walter Raleigh's contingent at the end of the 16th century, the Chowans had remained sovereign in the face of in the face of colonists' encroachment on their land. Yet the terms of the 1677 settlement with the English set the Chowans on the path to political collapse and led to the surrender of all their land claims. The 1677 treaty transformed the Chowans from a self-governing collective into tributary reservation Indians under the authority of the colonial government. Noting the political decline of the Chowans through the 17th and 18th centuries, William S. Powell, in his time-tested narrative of North Carolina history, assumed that the Chowans were extinct by 1820. You seeing that? In reality, as this article shows, Chowan descendants continued to live near their homeland after this point. And a few Chowan descendants still live on the lands once part of the Chowan reservation. Modern historians have overlooked Chowan persistence because the local government classified Chowan descendants as quote-unquote colored persons instead of Indians during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We know about this. We just read about how this was done in Virginia. It's the same thing again. It's happening again. Since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people documented simply as quote-unquote people of color and connected the histories of people categorized as quote-unquote Indians with those classified as quote-unquote colored. This article builds on that work. This article, continuing on to the next page, this article builds on that work and links the legacy of the Chowan Indians to the lives of their colored descendants. Yet unlike some of these studies, this article goes beyond viewing the recategorization of the Chowans and like groups as a form of documentary genocide or a denial of the Indianness of Indians, and instead demonstrates that racial categories are inherently unreliable markers of social cohesion and ancestral connections. Indian, colored, and other concepts are constructs of the imagination, not cogent signifiers of human difference. End quote. The whole point of reading this is to demonstrate that Virginia is not unique for its practice of paper genocide. It's not a uniquely Virginian thing. This was going on all over the place. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 didn't come by itself. That same year, they passed the Eugenical Sterilization Act of 1924. Remember, a moment ago, I really reminded you of what Congressman Moran said. Walter Plecker and other zealots, right? They were going around recklessly wiping out records for Black Indians in order to help reclassify them. And Plecker's the main, he's the poster child, he's the poster bureaucrat for the eugenics movement. He is it in its quintessence. Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, but in that same year, they passed the Eugenical Sterilization Act of 1924. The purpose of that law, according to the Federal Eugenics Archive, was, quote, to allow for the legal sterilization of people deemed to have undesirable traits, end quote. Sterilization, to make you sterile so that you cannot reproduce. This was used in combination with the Racial Integrity Act to wipe out the black Indian on paper, but also in the gene pool. This legislation, these legislations, they go hand in hand. Actually, what's funny, Virginia was late doing this. Montana and Delaware had already passed their own versions of the same sterilization legislation a year prior in 1923. In 1921, Pennsylvania had passed the same law also. The state founded by a man who praised Native Americans as Hebrews with an immaculate language and awe-inspiring culture had actually been trying to get that law passed for a long time by the time they finally did it in 1921. Alabama, Idaho, and who we just talked about, North Carolina, beat all of them and had done it by 1919. They were already done and had been for years. They got it done in 1919. From 1915 to 1917, Nebraska, South Dakota, Oregon, and New Hampshire all put variants of this same legislation on the books. I'll provide a link in the description box to the Eugenics Archive. It's a resource provided by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to serve as a database with research from universities and institutions all over the country. The point of this, though, is to demonstrate that conceptually eradicating the black Indian was already in progress on a national level long before Virginia's Racial Integrity Act. Though other states may not have legislated the alteration of records, there's ample evidence that white citizens simply took matters into their own hands to get the same job done in some of these states. Today, blacks tracing their ancestry often run into, oh, and by the way, let's just make sure that you understand that I started, when I was just giving you those examples, I started in 1924 and worked my way backward because we started with Virginia, but I could have worked my way forward and had a completely different list of states that did it after Virginia. This was this was rampant, and the colored Indians, let me say it a different way. The people who are today referred to as African Americans are there's an increasing number of us now trying to trace our ancestry, right? Many of you have awakened to the fact that you are in fact descended from Aboriginal nations. Many of us often run into this common experience. And on that note, I'm gonna cut transmission right here, but I'll be right back.